The moment the HOA thought they could take over, they had no idea who they were dealing with. They had built dozens of homes on what they assumed was public land, or worse, a disputed plot they believed they could pressure into their control. But this land had an owner, and he wasn't someone who would watch silently. His name was David, a man who had quietly accumulated wealth over the years through real estate investments and careful planning. He had inherited a large tract of land on the outskirts of the city, a property that had been in his family for generations. He was meticulous about boundaries, surveys, and legal documentation. In his mind, there was no room for error, and certainly no tolerance for people who thought they could overstep. The conflict began innocently enough, or at least that's how the HOA tried to frame it. They sent letters demanding that certain issues be resolved, claiming that part of David's property had been encroaching on what they called community land. David, polite and precise, responded with official deeds, boundary surveys, and historical property records. Each time, the HOA brushed it aside, insisting that construction could proceed. Before long, David discovered bulldozers clearing sections of his property. Roads were being paved, lots were being marked, and foundations were being poured. The HOA had mobilized an entire construction team, seemingly convinced that their legal threats and neighborhood influence would intimidate him into silence. David walked the land one evening, surveying the chaos, the freshly dug trenches, the piles of gravel, the half-built homes, all on land that belonged to him. He felt a mix of disbelief and quiet fury. The HOA had overstepped in the most audacious way possible. They had assumed they could claim his land by simply building on it. He knew that reacting impulsively would be a mistake. This wasn't a small property dispute. It was a full-scale encroachment. David spent the next few days documenting everything: photographs, drone footage, timestamps, and written records of communications. He consulted his lawyers and verified every boundary and every deed. There was no ambiguity. Every house, every road, every sidewalk was built on his property. The next HOA meeting was scheduled, and David attended, not to negotiate, but to observe. The president of the HOA, a woman named Linda, had been particularly aggressive in pushing the neighborhood expansion. She stood at the podium, speaking confidently, assuming that the residents and board members were united behind her. She didn't notice David sitting quietly at the back, reviewing his notes. She outlined the development plan, claiming community progress and the benefits of additional housing. Residents clapped, some out of agreement, some out of fear of speaking up. When she finished, David stood. His calm presence drew attention immediately. "Linda," he said evenly, "these properties are not yours to build on. Every lot, every road, and every structure on this land belongs to me." A murmur ran through the room. Residents looked at each other confused. Linda's confident expression faltered. "David, we were told this was disputed land. This is a public matter. The neighborhood—" "Disputed or not," David interrupted, "doesn't change the fact that it's mine. Every action you've taken here, every home built without consent, is illegal. You cannot assume ownership by constructing on my property." Whispers filled the room. Some residents glanced at Linda, unsure whether to continue supporting her aggressive expansion. David held up a folder, flipping through pages of official documents, maps, and historical records that left no room for doubt. "You see these deeds?" David said, projecting his voice across the hall. "They show clear ownership through generations. Your construction crews have encroached on my property. This is not a matter of negotiation. It's a matter of law." Linda's voice wavered as she tried to respond. We had approvals from the city surveyor." David raised a hand. "Approvals or not, you cannot override private property rights. This is not optional. You have built on land that does not belong to you, and every home constructed, Every road paved was done without my authorization. That makes it illegal, period. By now, some residents were visibly nervous, realizing that their investment in the neighborhood could be in jeopardy. They had assumed that the HOA's authority was absolute. They hadn't anticipated that the actual owner of the land would appear and assert his rights so decisively. David continued, his voice calm but unwavering. I am giving you a choice. You may vacate and remove your structures before further action is taken, or I will pursue legal measures to reclaim every inch of my property. The responsibility for the consequences lies entirely with you. Linda tried to regain control. We've already started construction. People have invested. You can't. You assumed my land was free to take. That was your mistake, David said firmly. You did not ask. You did not seek proper consent. You acted with arrogance, thinking I would not notice. I did notice, and I am here to correct it. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the HOA had underestimated David's resolve. Some residents began asking questions quietly. Realizing the precariousness of the situation, Linda struggled to respond, her authority crumbling as David presented evidence, legal documentation, and a plan for reclaiming his property. The room fell into an uneasy silence. David had made it clear he would not allow his property to be taken, no matter how many homes had been built. The HOA, despite its influence and connections, was facing the reality that they had crossed a line they could not reverse. Outside the hall, construction crews paused, unsure of what to do next. Word spread quickly. The land they had been building on belonged to a determined, wealthy owner who was prepared to enforce his rights legally and strategically. David stepped out, surveying the half-completed neighborhood. He wasn't acting out of anger. He was acting with precision. Each home would either be removed or fall under his ownership. Every road, every utility line laid without permission would be addressed. This wasn't just about property. It was about sending a clear message that no one could violate his land without consequences. And in that moment, the HOA and the residents began to understand. David was not a man to be underestimated. Every action he took from here on would be deliberate, strategic, and unstoppable. The neighborhood built on his land was no longer theirs. The following week, David began planning his strategy. He didn't want a drawn-out legal battle, though he was fully prepared for one. Instead, he wanted to reclaim his property with precision, ensuring the HOA understood they had made a grave mistake. He reviewed the surveys again, marking every plot, every street, and every home built without his consent. He spoke with engineers and surveyors, verifying that all structures could be legally challenged and, in some cases, removed if necessary. Every document was double-checked. There would be no loopholes for the HOA to exploit. Meanwhile, the residents who had invested in homes on his land started approaching him cautiously. Some apologized, clearly unaware that the land truly belonged to David. Others were defensive, insisting they had no choice but to trust the HOA's assurances. David listened politely, taking notes but made no promises. His goal wasn't to punish them personally. It was to reclaim his property and hold the HOA accountable. Linda, the HOA president, continued to try and assert control. She sent letters threatening legal action, claiming that the HOA had rights to the community land and that David was overstepping boundaries. But David remained calm. He had anticipated this. He had prepared counter-arguments and evidence to show every violation, every illegal construction, and every misrepresentation by the HOA. Then came the pivotal day. David, in coordination with his lawyers and local authorities, executed the first step of his plan. He issued a notice declaring that all construction had been unauthorized, demanding immediate cessation of work and access for inspectors to confirm property ownership. This was followed by an official injunction backed by legal authority, giving him the right to enforce his property claims. The HOA scrambled. Construction crews were halted mid-work. Linda held an emergency meeting, panicked that her authority was slipping. She sent out emails trying to rally the residents, but David's documentation was airtight. The deeds, surveys, and historical records were irrefutable. David didn't stop there. He wanted the HOA and the residents to fully grasp the consequences of ignoring property rights. He arranged for professional appraisers to assess every structure on his land. The results were staggering. The value of the homes, streets, and landscaping built without permission far exceeded what the HOA had imagined. The financial risk to those who had blindly followed Linda's direction was immense. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. News outlets caught wind of the situation. An HOA had built an entire development on private property without permission, and the rightful owner had taken swift, strategic action. Residents began questioning the HOA's leadership. Some withdrew from agreements. Others sought legal advice to protect themselves. David moved carefully, reclaiming his land step by step. Streets were marked with official notices. Construction sites were secured, and any new attempts to build were stopped before they could begin. It wasn't about brute force. It was about precision, legality, and overwhelming evidence. Linda grew increasingly desperate. She attempted to hold meetings, trying to negotiate with David, claiming she had acted in good faith. David listened, but remained firm. Good faith does not give you the right to ignore property ownership. You assumed my land was free to use. That was a mistake you will not repeat. Tension escalated as David began issuing notices for removal of the unauthorized structures. Some residents resisted, hoping to challenge him legally. But David had anticipated that too. He provided the courts with all his documentation, land deeds, historical records, surveyor reports, and proof of the HOA's unilateral actions. The legal system sided with David. Temporary restraining orders were issued against the HOA, halting any further construction and authorizing the removal of structures built on his property. Bulldozers and contractors, now legally sanctioned, began dismantling the roads, fences, and foundations. Linda realized too late that she had underestimated him. Every attempt to counteract his actions failed. She had assumed that the HOA's collective influence could overpower a single property owner. But David's combination of preparation, patience, and legal expertise proved unstoppable. As the neighborhood slowly returned to its original state, residents finally understood the full scope of the situation. They had been caught in the middle of a conflict caused by a power-hungry HOA president. Some expressed gratitude to David, recognizing that he had acted fairly, professionally, and decisively. Others faced financial losses from homes or improvements they had begun but ultimately had to remove. David's method was simple yet effective. Document everything, act legally, and maintain patience while allowing the HOA's overreach to reveal itself. The spectacle of his careful, methodical reclamation sent a clear message to anyone who thought they could seize property through audacity rather than rights. By the end of the week, the land was fully back under his control. Streets were cleared, half-built homes dismantled, and the area returned to its natural state. David had reclaimed what was his, and he had done so with authority, leaving no room for the HOA or Linda to challenge him further. Neighbors began to speak in hushed tones about the lessons learned. No one dared cross him or question his authority again. David's actions reinforced a simple truth. Assumptions about power and influence are meaningless when faced with knowledge, preparation, and determination. Linda's attempts to save face were futile. Her aggressive expansion, once celebrated by a few, was now condemned. She had learned the hard way that underestimating someone prepared, meticulous, and unafraid to enforce their rights was a costly mistake. For David, the victory wasn't just about reclaiming his land. It was about asserting accountability. The HOA's arrogance had met precise action, and the consequences were clear. They could no longer manipulate or intimidate without consequence. By the time he left the reclaimed property for the weekend, David had a sense of satisfaction. Not vindictive, but decisive. The neighborhood had been returned to its rightful state. The HOA had been humbled, and a clear warning had been sent. Private property is not to be trifled with, and audacity without authority can lead to dramatic repercussions. David knew that reclaiming the land legally was only part of the battle. He wanted a final move that would ensure the HOA and Linda could never underestimate him again. The plans he had laid over the past weeks were ready to be executed, carefully, decisively, and publicly. He began by sending formal eviction notices to all construction crews still associated with the HOA, along with certified letters to every HOA member involved in the project. Each notice cited property rights, legal violations, and potential civil liabilities. The language was clear. The land belonged to David, and anyone attempting to build or remain on it without permission would be held accountable. Word spread fast. By mid-morning, reporters from local news outlets arrived, drawn by the story of an entire neighborhood being built illegally on private property. Residents, initially confused and fearful, were eager to see how David would handle the situation. David stood at the edge of the reclaimed land, surveying the dismantled streets and partially removed homes. He spoke to the reporters in a calm but firm tone. This land has always had a rightful owner. The attempts to bypass the law were bold, but boldness without authority never prevails. Every decision I've made has been legal, transparent, and deliberate. This neighborhood will not exist here unless it follows the proper rules. The cameras captured the dismantled homes, the leveled streets, and David standing firmly among the evidence of the HOA's overreach. Linda arrived shortly after, expecting to negotiate or intimidate, but David had anticipated this. He met her at the edge of the property, the scene crowded with reporters and residents. "Linda," David said evenly, "you assumed this land was yours to use. You built without permission, ignored legal notices, and misled residents. That ends today." Linda attempted to speak, her voice shaky. "David, we were only trying to develop the community." "Your intentions do not excuse your actions," David interrupted. "This is not about community development. This is about property rights and accountability. You and the HOA have crossed the line." The residents watched in stunned silence. Many had supported the HOA's projects initially, believing the claims of shared community land. Now they realized the truth. Their trust had been misplaced, and the HOA's leadership was reckless. David made sure to handle everything methodically. Contractors were brought in under his supervision to safely dismantle the remaining structures. Any materials that could be salvaged were returned or donated, but the streets, fences, and foundations that had been laid without consent were removed completely. Linda, flustered and humiliated, attempted one final negotiation. "David, surely we can find a compromise. The residents invested their money." David shook his head. "A compromise requires mutual respect and legality. There was none here. I have documented every action you've taken illegally. This land is mine, and I will ensure it stays that way." By mid-afternoon, the reclaimed property was fully secured. Official markers were placed to indicate boundaries, and legal notices were filed with the city, leaving no ambiguity about ownership. The HOA had no further authority over the land. Residents began approaching David, some apologetic, some curious. "I had no idea the land belonged to you," one neighbor admitted. I trusted the HOA's assurances. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." David nodded. "I understand. Your mistake was trusting the wrong people. But the important thing now is that everyone knows the truth, and the law is being respected." Linda tried to challenge him again, but it was too late. David had not only reclaimed his property, he had also exposed the HOA's overreach publicly. Local authorities and the media were documenting everything. Any future attempts to interfere would face immediate legal action. As the sun began to set, David walked the perimeter of his property. The neighborhood that had been illegally built was gone. The land, his family's heritage, was fully back under his control. There was a sense of calm, not from victory alone, but from the certainty that justice had been served. In the following weeks, the HOA faced investigations and lawsuits from various parties, including residents who had been misled and financially affected. Linda resigned under pressure, and the board was forced to restructure its leadership to prevent further abuse. David's decisive actions had set a precedent. Overreach and arrogance would not go unchallenged. David, meanwhile, implemented permanent security measures. Cameras, signage, and regular patrols ensured no one could attempt such an audacious move again. He had acted decisively but fairly, reclaiming his land without unnecessary hostility. The message was clear: property rights were non-negotiable, and those who attempted to exploit others' trust would face the consequences. Residents gradually came to respect David's authority. They realized that standing up to the HOA's overreach wasn't just about one property owner. It was about protecting the integrity of the entire community. Many of them volunteered to help restore the land where possible, acknowledging the disruption that had occurred and contributing to returning the area to a more natural state. David's final move wasn't dramatic in a physical sense. It was strategic, thorough, and undeniable. By combining legal authority, documentation, and public accountability, he not only reclaimed his property, but also ensured that no one could question his ownership again. The HOA had assumed power they didn't have, and now they faced the consequences. By the end of the month, David stood on the edge of his reclaimed land, watching the sunset. The cleared property stretched for acres, the evidence of the HOA's miscalculation a permanent reminder. He felt satisfaction, not from punishment, but from justice. Every action taken had been measured, every step deliberate, and the result was unmistakable. The land was his, the HOA's influence over it was gone, and the lesson had been delivered publicly and clearly. This was the kind of resolution that left no room for doubt. Arrogance, overreach, and false assumptions had been met with preparation, patience, and authority. David's land, heritage, and hard work were protected. The HOA's audacity had backfired spectacularly, and anyone who had doubted him now knew the price of crossing someone who understood the law and respected his own property. For Linda, humiliation, legal consequences, and public exposure were the result. For David, there was peace, security, and the satisfaction of having taken control of a situation that could have been disastrous. And for the residents, a lesson. Always verify claims, understand rights, and never underestimate someone determined to protect what is theirs. The land was safe, the neighborhood dismantled, and David's decisive action had created a story that would be remembered in the community for years to come.